Okay, we were looking at, we're actually on Roman numeral 9. You've got that, Dan. The man's sin and the global flood. And, you know, there's just a lot of things that we can't spend time on in this, but we're just kind of hitting some highlights. And we talked about the importance of the flood. It is the greatest single geological event the world has ever seen, you know, after creation, of course. But, you know, you're either a catastrophist or you're an evolutionist. And the Bible clearly teaches catastrophism. The world in which we live is, I can't really describe how different it is from the world, the antediluvian world, the world that was here before. God destroyed it with water. And there's all kinds of information, if you want to study that in detail, that you can get if that interests you. I would, just some simple stuff, I would point you to, for those of you that have acquired, picked up the Defending the Faith Study Bibles from the Apology Express, you may not have been able to because they ran out, but if you get one, I've been reading it for my Bible reading this year, trying to read all the articles and the footnotes. But I'm only on Genesis chapter about 15, and I'm already on about page 70 or 80 in that Bible. So it tells you how much information is in there. There is an article there on page 56 through 61, evidence for the flood from Scripture and Science. I would recommend that to you. There's also, within that article, there's a little sub-paragraph on flood legends. I would also encourage you to read the article on pages 72 and 73 on flood legends. And what do I mean by flood legends? I use that term.
Accounts of the flood from ancient civilization.
From all civilization, there's at least, they count a minimum of 200. And it could be as many as 500 flood legends from civilizations around the globe. In other words, stories, accounts that people tell. Now, obviously, they're not going to be accurate. I mean, these things were handed down. But it just goes to show that every ancient civilization upon earth knew of this event. It was told from their fathers and passed on down. That's just one of the things that I would mention to you that you might want to read. We looked at Genesis chapter 7, 19 through 20 last week, verses 19 and 20. We were looking at the extent and duration of the flood, and this idea that sometimes gets thrown out there that, especially by theistic evolutionists maybe and others. I don't know why an evolutionist and atheist would care, but for people in the religious world, sometimes they'll throw out the idea of a local flood, that somehow this was just in Noah's area. So we were talking about how that in Genesis chapter 7, it talks about all of the high mountains were covered. In fact, it says all the high mountains under all, or the whole heavens. So that's pretty comprehensive terminology, and it's even more so in the Hebrew language. And so we kind of left off with that, and so I was going to go from there. I think in your outline it talks about the testimony of Peter. So let's go back to 2 Peter chapter 3. And this thing, let me again refer you to the Defending the Faith Study Bible. I mean, it goes through all of these things, talks about, you know, the size of the ark, the number of animals, all those things, those details that skeptics try to poke holes in. You know, all of that's included either in separate articles or in the footnotes within this particular work. It's really a compilation of a lot of things they've put together over the years. They've just put it in the context of the particular scripture. So it's a very comprehensive and valuable aid. But look at 2 Peter chapter 3. And let's pick up in about verse see, verse 3. Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days, Christian dispensation, walking according to their own lust, and say, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. These are uniformitarians, right? Present's the key to the past. Everything going on now is the way it's always been. Same processes, nothing's changed. And they're saying, we don't believe that Christ is coming back because things just go on the way they always have. Peter here is talking about a judgment day for all mankind. And so he compares it to something. For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth standing out of water and in the water. Let's stop right there. That's creation there. For this they willfully forget, that by the word of God the heavens were of old. God created it ex nihilo, out of nothing, just with a spoken word. And this old earth was standing out of water and in the water, by which the world that then existed, now we're going to talk about the flood, perished, being flooded with water. But the heavens and the earth, which are now preserved by the same word, are reserved for fire until the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Now here's the question. What good would it have done Peter if he's trying to impress upon these people the fact that there is going to be a judgment day for all men, and that the whole earth and all of creation is going to be destroyed by fire? What good would it have done him to compare that to a local flood? In other words, if I could pack my bags and just move to somewhere else to escape, and if anybody had done that, if anybody had been able to pack their bags and escape the flood of Noah's day, well then frankly I can say, well hey, when Christ comes back, I can probably do what? I can probably do like they did. Look at the difference in the warnings in Matthew chapter 24, before you get to about verse 35. Jesus tells those people, when he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, which was a terrible, terrible event, but it was local in nature. He told those people, when you see this, this, and this, when you see these signs, you need to do what? Head for the hills. Don't go back and pick up anything. There's no time. You just grab what you got and get out. But when it comes to my return, he starts talking about, he says, heaven and earth shall pass away, but my word shall not pass away. But of that day, what day? The day that heaven and earth pass away, nobody knows. There will be no signs, and it wouldn't matter anyway. You could have all the signs you wanted. There's nowhere to go. And there was nowhere to go for these people on the day of Noah. That's his point. And so it would have done Peter no good to compare it, to try to use the flood to compare to the second coming of Christ if it were not universal, because the judgment day is going to be universal.
All of us are here.
So let's go to Matthew chapter 24. I just mentioned that. And then D on your outline talks about the testimony of Christ. You can also go to Luke chapter 17 for this material, about verse 26. But we'll use Matthew 24. Now go back to the verses I mentioned. He's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem until he gets down to 35. Because 34, he says, this generation will by no means pass till all these things take place. He said, there's people living right now that will be living when all the things I just talked about from verse 1 to verse 34 take place. So anytime you hear a premillennialist try to use anything before verse 35 and apply that to the second coming of Christ, he's in error. He doesn't understand. It's improper exegesis. Because Jesus says, there are some, this generation won't pass until these things happen. And notice the difference in his terminology. All up until verse 35, 34, he's talking about these things, these things, these things. After that verse, he starts talking about that day. And he says, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took who away? All away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. He compares again the flood of Noah, universal flood of Noah, to his universal judgment, second coming. Every eye will see him. Even those Revelation says that pierced him. Right? So, Christ says the flood is universal. And that makes sense. I mean, the point E, the necessity of an ark. Why would you need an ark if it was not universal? Some writers have said, well, it was just an object lesson. Really? Well, they don't understand the concept of divine economy. God doesn't have people do silly, unnecessary things. You're going to have Noah build an ark for 100 years as an object lesson? Something that big? And by the way, you know, we always assumed the ark was only 450 feet long based on an 18-inch cubit. I don't know how big those people were that lived before the flood. Adam and Eve had the most perfect genome ever. They were created with perfect genes. They were perfect physical specimens. And the environment in which they live allowed people to live over 900 years of age. I suspect there were some pretty good athletes in that day. Now, not that they organized professional leagues like we do. But I suspect physically they were something to behold. Because ever since the flood, you saw the rapid deterioration of men's ages. Our genetic material has continued to deteriorate. So I don't know if a cubit was 18 inches. A cubit could have been 24 inches. If you're measuring from a man's elbow to the tip of his finger, average. I don't know how big those figures were. I don't know how big that barge was. No, it was minimum, probably a 450 to 500 feet long, but it could have been longer. There was a big boat, I know that. Go back to Genesis chapter 7. We talked about the water covering all the high mountains under all the heaven. And high, of course, is a relative term, as we talked about. Because high then is not high like it is now, more than likely. Back to chapter 7. Go back after that. Look down at verse 21, which comes after. And all flesh, wait a minute, don't go over that too fast. What does it say?
All flesh.
All flesh died that moved on the earth. Birds and cattle and beasts and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth and every man. Now it's qualified here, every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath, the spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. All in whose nostrils was the breath of life. Spirit is omitted in Septuagint. That's subjected there in the King James. So now think about it for a minute. Not every creature died. What creatures died?
Earthly. Birds.
The ones that had to breathe air. Fish didn't die. There's plenty of water for the fish. Amphibians, bugs, So it was universal in nature. And sometimes people say, well, that's a lot of water, right? What happened when this thing started? What does it say? What does the Bible say? Well, more than likely, it would appear from the text that they hadn't seen the rain. But that was a special kind of rain. Windows of heaven were open. Fountains of the great deep were broken up. Unbelievable amounts of volcanic activity. Water. I suspect, and more than likely, it could have very well been that there was one continent at the time. And these things were moving in a hurry. These tectonic plates that we know about now. So somebody says, well, where did all the water go? We can go to Psalm 104. Psalm 104 tells you what happened. Do what? Plates, which the continents sit on, which are moving even today. You know how far a tectonic plate moves each year? It's something like 4, 5, 6 centimeters. How big is a centimeter?
Very small.
I mean, we're talking about not very much. Yeah, or less. But what if these things were moving several feet? All right. Look at Psalm 104. Look at verse 5. You who laid the foundations of the earth so that it should not be moved forever, you covered it with the deep as with a garment. The water stood above the mountains. And more than likely, the mountains of the pre-Evangelical world weren't like they are today. You didn't have all that. We've got some pretty dramatic weather based upon a lot of that to do with geography. They didn't have all that. The water stood above the mountains, flood. At your rebuke, they fled. At the voice of your thunder, they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. Now notice, you have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. The world has been changed to the extent that the oceans cannot flood the mainland again. It can't happen anymore. He's changed the whole topography of the earth since the antediluvian world. And we'll talk about this some more a little bit, but you'll have to do your own study.
American Standard will say as the mountains rose, the valleys sank.
Yeah, which is probably, and that's a better translation, and we'll talk about that. The American Standard, and maybe even the King James, says the mountains rose and the valleys sank. And so we'll talk about that, but you know, the Rocky Mountains and the Himalayas and all that, as those when tectonic plates move, one is diving below the other into the mantle. So you can imagine if they're moving pretty fast, how quick these things could form. We'll talk about it a little more as we go through our next section, the geologic timetable and the age of the earth. Let me refer you to, let's go to Roman numeral 10. Danny. And let me refer you, this material in Roman numeral 10 of your outline, you can also find the same material on pages 45 through 49 of the Defending the Faith Study Bible. You can also find on pages 76 through 79 an article entitled "Do Old Earth Dating Techniques Prove the Earth is Old?" So what you have here is you have one article that gives you a bunch of reasons, scientific reasons and biblical reasons to believe the earth is young. The other article takes a critical look at old dating dating methods that say the earth is old and shows the flaws in that particular thing. But as we've already mentioned, the age of the earth is an extremely important difference. in worldviews. And so, if you go anywhere nowadays on vacation, you go to the Grand Canyon, and you got the little park ranger who's out very seriously, has a degree in any kind of science, if he has a degree at all. But he's been given the spell to explain to all the little people following him around in the Grand Canyon that, you know, look at all these layers of sedimentary rock, and you know, these have been laid down over millions and billions of years, you know, because it takes so long for all that to happen, and that's the spill you're going to get when you go to places like that. The interesting thing, and then you go to the you go to the textbooks, the science textbooks, and you see one of the biggest things that they use for perpetrating the myth of evolution, and that's the geologic column, right? By the way, you can't go anywhere in the world and find the actual geologic column in one place. But the interesting thing about the geologic column is that it was actually devised prior to 1860 by catastrophists, by creationists. It wasn't devised by evolution, but it's used by them. To say that the universe is, you know, whatever it is, it's like 13 billion years old, and the Earth is about our solar system is about 4.6 billion years old, and supposedly that's what this geologic column is going to tell us. And it's hard. I mean, you know, when you perpetrate something like this on the public for 150 years, and it's taught in all the schools and colleges, no matter how absurd it is, it's tough to get people to see the truth. I like what one writer said: time, as poets and insurance salesmen remind us, is the enemy of life. But time has its friends too. Without great, incomprehensible, immeasurable stretches of time to fall back on, the evolutionists would be sitting ducks for the barbed queries of even high school students. Time is the evolutionist refuge from the slings and arrows of logic, scientific evidence, common sense, and the multiplication table. With an evolutionist, time is everything. The problem, of course, is there is no, as we've mentioned before, there's no power in time. Time is just time. It's not a creative force. So what we want to do is look at some evidences, and you've got about over 20 of these things listed in your outline. We're not going to look at all of these. You can read them on your own. We're going to get some highlights. You know, when the earth was created, the universe was created by God. We talk about the doctrine of apparent age. When Adam and Eve were one day old, how old did they look? I mean, were Adam and Eve walking and talking zygotes? And did they look like a blob of tissue would in the mother's womb? I mean, how old did they look when they were one day old? Did they look like a one-day-old baby? I mean, to ask the question, to answer it, right? Adam and Eve were fully functioning adults.
When they were one day.
But if you'd ask them how old you are,
One day old.
well, I'm one day old. I'm 2 days old. Man, you look good for your age. Or you look old for your age. So did everything else. They were told they could do what in the garden? What were they told they could do? Eat. Well, that means you got fully functioning fruit hanging from the trees. How long did it take that fruit to get there? You understand what I'm saying? The doctrine of apparent age. Somebody says, well, you know, God's being kind of sneaky there. He's trying to fool us. He's making something look old when it's really young. No, he's not, because he told us what he did. He said, I created it in 6 days. So when Adam and Eve looked up in the sky, they would have seen what? Further than that. Starlight? sun? How long does it take the sun rays to get to the earth? No, it's longer than that. It's 8 minutes. But they saw all of that, fully functioning. So, you understand when somebody takes a tree and they say, well, this tree is a certain amount of age because of the rings. Well, what do you think about the trees in the garden? Did they have rings already? Yes, they did, because God didn't make trees for us to count time. The purpose of tree rings is strength of the tree. It's not for us to count time. And when you start talking about catastrophic events like the flood and the ice age that occurred immediately thereafter because of the flood, you're talking, you can't rely upon tree rings. These trees under those kinds of conditions, when somebody says a tree is 4,000 years old, trees would put on a lot more rings, but I'm getting askew. But the point I'm making is that the world was made fully functioning. And so they start talking about daughter elements and half-lives. Well, I don't know. These things have been here. They were already made. And so, yes, certain attributes of the earth would appear old, but there are several evidences, scientific evidences, that tell us that the earth is young. A simple addition of the genealogies in Genesis 5 reveals that from the creation to the flood was about 1,650 years. Then you get to the genealogies of Genesis 11, which do not use the same terminology as that of Genesis 5. And because of that, the time period from the flood, or in the genealogies of Genesis 11, to the time of Abram, could actually run anywhere from about 400 years to about 4,500 years. When people read Eastern literature, they assume that they wrote like Americans, like English people do, and they do not. They do not write chronologically. The Bible is not written necessarily in every place chronologically. And you know that. You've studied it at all. And when you read these genealogies, they don't always list, we assume that the son that's listed first is what? Firstborn. That's not necessarily the case. Because that's not necessarily the purpose of all the genealogies. A lot of times the son that's listed first in the genealogy is which son? The most important one, which in the Bible is generally who? Generally. Who's the most important son of anybody in the Bible?
Christ.
No, I mean in general. The one that's in the Messianic seed line. Right? So people read, for instance, the account of Abram, and they think a straight reading of that Terah was 70 years old when he had Abram, but if you read on further in the text, you'll find out that that's not the case. Abram was probably born when Terah was 130 years old. He was not the firstborn son. He's just listing the children. Abram's listed first because Abram's the important. So that's why those genealogies, there's some flexibility in there. And so, while the flood may have happened about 4,350 years ago, it could have been a little longer. The point is that the world, according to the Bible, and we know from Abram to Christ is 2,000 years, and up from Christ to today is 2,000 years. The point is, the earth is a minimum of 6,000 years old, but it is not older than 10, no matter how far you stretch the genealogy. But there's an upward maximum. So, let's look at some of these evidences from science. We'll look at some. We're not going to go over all of these. But I listed there first, paleontology, archaeology, out-of-place fossils. What are out-of-place fossils? All right, let me ask you this. If you're an evolutionist, did a man ever see a dinosaur, for instance? No. Dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, right? Men have only been around for about 2 million years. We're at the very top. We're at the very end of the top of the geological column. We're just a fraction of the time. If the Earth is 4.6 million years old, we've only been here 2 million years. And coal is supposed to have been laid down in the Carboniferous period, 250 million years ago. Coal. There was a guy named Dr. Albert G. Ingalls, who back in the 40s found a human footprint in a coal bed in Kentucky. And he kept going, and he found them in Missouri, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and West Virginia, going toward the Rocky Mountains. Human footprints in coal beds. How's that possible? They're supposed to be separated by 250 million years. So he was invited by the editors of Scientific American to write an article to explain, when I say explain away what he found. And here's what he wrote. If man, or even his ape ancestor, or even the ape ancestor's early mammal ancestor, existed as far back as the Carboniferous period in any shape, then the whole science of geology is so completely wrong that all geologists will resign their jobs and take up truck driving. Well, they should have. Hence, for the present at least, science rejects the attractive explanation that man made these mysterious prints in the mud of the Carboniferous period with his feet. So, in normal science, here's the way it works. I have a theory, I have a hypothesis, and I go out and I collect what? Data. Evidence. And if the data or the evidence collected says one thing that doesn't comport with my theory or my hypothesis, what do? I reject the theory or the hypothesis, or I modify it, change it, to accord with the evidence that I found. But you understand, in the one area of science called evolution, it's just the opposite. I have a theory that must be upheld at all costs, because I cannot ever accept the idea that there is a God. And therefore, whatever evidence or data I find, if it doesn't comport with my theory, then I'm going to do what? I'm going to reject the evidence and hang on to my theory. That's the only area in science that happens. In 1936, a metal hammer with a wooden handle was dug out of a Cretaceous limestone, estimated by evolutionists to be 135 million years old, in London, Texas. How's that happen? And everybody's heard, I think you've heard of trilobites. A small marine arthropod with a hard exoskeleton is considered to be extremely important. It's classified as an index fossil, the earliest period of the Paleozoic era, the Cambrian. And you know what they do with index fossils. They take the chronology of index fossils and they impose them on the rocks, right? They say, well, if you find this fossil, this rock must be this old. Right? So the assumption that evolution is true is used to place these index fossils in the appropriate order from simple to complex. And then the index fossils are used to date the layers to prove that evolution is true. It's circular reasoning, as we've already mentioned. Index fossils this old, why? Because the rock's that old and we assume evolution is true. Well, how do you know the rock's that old? Because the index fossil is true. Here's what one evolutionist said about that whole deal before we get to the trilobites. He said, the intelligent layman has long suspected circular reasoning in the use of rocks to date fossils and fossils to date rocks. The geologist has never bothered to think of a good reply, feeling the explanations are not worth the trouble as long as the work brings results. This is supposed to be hard-headed pragmatism. The rocks do date the fossils, but the fossils date the rocks more accurately. Stratigraphy cannot avoid this kind of reasoning if it insist on using only temporal concepts because circularity is inherent in the derivation of time scales. In other words, yeah, it's circular reasoning, but that's just a little bit. So, trilobites allegedly flourished 500 million years before man. 500 million years, that's 500 million years. That's a long time, right? In 1968, evolutionist William Meister, an amateur fossilologist, was working near Antelope Springs, Utah, and he was working way up the side of a mountain 2,000 feet to a ledge. He broke open a slab of rock with his hammer, and what did he find? To his amazement, on one side, the footprint of a human with a trilobite in it. I just told you what a trilobite is. It's an index fossil. It's a little, looks like a bug. It's a marine anthropod. It looks kind of like a roach that would live underwater.
Somebody stepped on it.
So you got a footprint, and by the way, it was a sandal. And here's a trilobite fossilized in this footprint. So he also found in the area more human footprints and dinosaur prints. So the question then remains is, how can there be a trilobite and a human footprint if they are separated by 500 million years? That's what we call out-of-place fossils. Out-of-place fossils, which is different from the next one on your list, which is polystrate fossils. Anybody know what a polystrate fossil is? Absolutely. It is a fossil which goes through several layers of supposedly the geologic column. So, for instance, there have been trees. They have found a whale. Swamp plants, catfish, sticking straight up and down through several layers of the geologic column. You say, why is that important? Well, here's why it's important. Supposedly, it took millions and billions of years to lay down these layers. A tree, if it gets stuck in the bottom layer, is not going to wait around a gazillion years for the other layers to form. What's going to happen to it? Well, it's already dead probably. What's going to happen to it? It's going to decay. If it's just sitting up, if it's just sticking up exposed to the elements, it's going to decay. It's not going to be there 500 million years, a billion years, while these other layers get slowly laid down. It doesn't work that way. Anything that's fossilized has to be buried quickly, like the flood. It has to be buried quickly. It has to be fossilized quickly. If it was sticking out of the ground, what about a whale? You think a dead whale sticking out of the ground? It's gonna. I mean, what's going to happen to a dead whale sticking out of the ground? Say his head's stuck in the ground, the rest of him sticking up out of the ground. What's going to happen? He's going to decay. What else is going to happen? Yeah, he's going to be eaten by scavengers. Polystrate fossils, they can't explain that. You know, they formed a bunch of those. Mount St. Helens formed a bunch of those. Trees got buried in that eruption. We're going to skip DNA and ancient bacteria. You can read that for yourself in the book. And we'll pick up next time with human population statistics. You'll love this one. How many people would there be if the Earth was 4.6 billion? Here it is. You got somewhere you have to.